But there is hope on the horizon. Today should mark the beginning of a new opportunity.
For centuries, Africa has been told what to be, what to trade, and what to believe. Its lands have been mapped by foreign hands, its leaders dictated by outside interests, and its future scripted by those who see it as nothing more than a resource mine. But something is changing. A new movement is rising, one that doesn't ask for permission or wait for approval. At the center of it stands Ghana. It all starts with Mahama's victory in the recent elections. The morning after, Ghana woke up to more than just a new leader. It woke up to a new chapter in history. The streets were alive with celebration, but beneath the cheers and waving flags, something deeper was unfolding. This wasn't just another election, it was a message to Africa and the world. For decades, Ghana had been caught in a delicate balance between sovereignty and foreign influence. Leaders came and went, some promising change, others maintaining the status quo. But Mahama's return to power was different. This time, the stakes were higher. It wasn't just about governance. It was about rewriting Ghana's place in the world. His victory sent a clear signal. The old order is shaking. To the West, Mahama's return wasn't just a political shift. It was a strategic threat. For years, Ghana had been a stable partner, willing to engage diplomatically, accept aid, and enter military and economic partnerships that always came with invisible strings attached. But the world had changed, and Africa had changed. In the past, foreign powers controlled African nations through direct colonial rule. When that ended, they adapted, using debt, military agreements, and political interference to maintain their grip. Ghana was no exception. Yet here was Mahama, a leader unafraid to push back. His return to power signified something dangerous to those who benefited from Africa's reliance on Western policies, a country rich in resources and strategic influence, choosing its own path. This election was a referendum on Ghana's sovereignty. It tested whether the people would choose a leader aligned with the West's expectations or one who would chart a different course. The answer was loud and clear. Mahama's win wasn't just his own, it was a win for a rising Africa that refuses to be dictated to. But why are we talking about his win? What does Mahama's leadership represent? Leadership is about more than policies, it's about perception. To many in Ghana and across the continent, Mahama represents an Africa that is done waiting for permission. He stands as a reminder that Ghana's independence was won through the defiant will of its people, not negotiations. His election symbolizes a rejection of Western paternalism, no more external forces treating Ghana as an experiment for democracy on their terms. It's a push for real economic independence, not just reforms that satisfy foreign investors, but policies that put Ghana first. It's a demand for respect on the global stage. Ghana is no longer a junior partner in world affairs. It's a sovereign nation with its own priorities. This shift isn't just about Ghana. The rest of Africa is watching. Elections in one country rarely make waves beyond their borders, but this was different. Ghana is often seen as a political barometer for the continent, a nation whose democratic processes influence trends. Mahama's win sent shockwaves across Africa, where nations have long struggled to balance local governance with foreign pressures. Countries in West Africa, the Sahel, and beyond have been moving away from foreign control in recent years. Ghana's election served as confirmation that this momentum was growing. If Ghana, a country historically seen as stable and pro-West, could choose a leader advocating for self-determination, what would stop others from doing the same? The message was clear. Africa is no longer accepting leaders who prioritize foreign interests over their people. The era of puppet governments is fading. A new generation of leadership is emerging, one that values sovereignty over subservience. Ghana had just set the precedent. With every power shift, there are winners and losers, and Mahama's victory left some deeply unsettled. For Western nations, Ghana has always been a key regional ally, a country they could depend on to support their diplomatic and military strategies. But Mahama's return signaled uncertainty. Would Ghana still cooperate on military bases? Would it continue economic agreements that benefited foreign powers over locals? Would Mahama strengthen ties with other anti-Western African leaders? The uncertainty sent diplomats and analysts scrambling. Political think tanks in Washington, London, and Brussels were already drafting reports on what this meant for Western interests in Africa. The truth was simple: Ghana was changing, and there was no stopping it. For too long, Ghana's policies have been shaped by external forces, trade agreements, foreign aid, and military alliances that benefited outsiders more than its people. Mahama's election represents a return to something deeper, a return to Ghana's true identity. This is the Ghana of Nkrumah, the Ghana that refused to bow, the Ghana that dared to dream of an Africa standing on its own. But dreams are only as strong as the will to fight for them, and Mahama's biggest battles are just beginning. Challenging the status quo comes at a price. Will Mahama succeed in his vision, or will the forces of the old world fight back harder than ever? The answers will shape not just Ghana's future, but the fate of an entire continent. Now let's talk about the decision Mahama made that got everyone talking. It was a decision no one saw coming, a move that sent shockwaves from Accra to Washington. John Mahama stood before the nation and declared what many had whispered but never dared to say outright: Ghana would no longer host U.S. military forces. For years, American troops had maintained a presence in Ghana under the guise of security cooperation. Now, Mahama had made it clear that era was over. This wasn't just a diplomatic shift, it was a direct challenge to the post-Cold War system that had allowed Western powers to use Africa as a strategic chessboard. And the world was watching, but why was the US military in Ghana in the first place? Officially, it was part of a broader security partnership. On paper, the mission was simple: help strengthen Ghana's ability to fight insurgency, respond to regional threats, and build a modern defense force. But the reality was far more complex. The US has a long history of embedding itself within foreign militaries, not just to provide assistance, but to gain influence over key decision-making processes. The American military doctrine isn't just about fighting wars, it's about ensuring that allies remain dependent on US military hardware, intelligence, and training. In Ghana's case, that meant access to strategic military installations that could serve US interests in West Africa, intelligence sharing agreements that prioritize Washington's agenda over Ghana's sovereignty, and a growing reliance on US military aid that created a cycle where Ghana's defense infrastructure became tied to foreign support. Then, there was the bigger picture: the Pentagon's long-term interest in securing a military foothold across the African continent. Since the early 2000s, the United States has expanded its military operations in Africa under AFRICOM, United States Africa Command. Officially, AFRICOM's role is to promote stability, counterinsurgent threats, and support African militaries. But, in practice, it has functioned as a tool for military dominance, placing US forces in key locations across the continent while ensuring that African nations never develop truly independent security capabilities. To Mahama, Ghana had a choice: continue playing by Washington's rules or reclaim full control of its defense policies. For him, the issue wasn't just about foreign troops, it was about who controlled Ghana's future. The presence of US forces meant Ghana was part of a larger system of geopolitical power plays, where its national security was shaped by foreign interests. The consequences were real. Ghana had limited autonomy in regional security matters. The government was expected to align with US foreign policy, whether it benefited Ghana or not. The presence of US troops made Ghana a potential target in conflicts that weren't its own. But the biggest issue? Ghana's growing inability to make sovereign defense decisions without Western approval. To Mahama, this was unacceptable. He concluded that Ghana's security should be dictated by Ghana, not Washington, not Brussels, not London. Almost immediately, Mahama's announcement was met with panic in Washington. The US had spent years securing its military influence in West Africa, and now one of its most stable partners was pulling away. This wasn't just about Ghana, it was about the domino effect it could trigger. If Ghana expelled US troops, what would stop other African nations from following suit? Western officials scrambled to frame Mahama's decision as reckless and short-sighted. Analysts warned that Ghana was putting itself at risk, suggesting that without U.S. support, the country would be vulnerable to insurgency, instability, and economic repercussions. Some even suggested that Mahama was playing into the hands of foreign adversaries, a clear attempt to link his decision to the growing influence of China and Russia in Africa. But Mahama remained firm. Across the continent, his move was seen not as a risk, but as a bold assertion of African sovereignty. For years, countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had taken similar steps, rejecting foreign military dominance in favor of homegrown security solutions. Now, Ghana was joining the movement. This was more than just one country telling the US to leave. It was a declaration that Africa would no longer be a passive participant in global military affairs. It was a statement that African security should be handled by Africans. The military partnerships should be equitable, not exploitative. The era of foreign troops on African soil must come to an end. What comes next? With US troops set to withdraw, Ghana now faces a crucial challenge: how to build a truly independent defense system. Mahama's government has already hinted at new security strategies, including strengthening regional military alliances within Africa, investing in homegrown defense infrastructure, and partnering with nations that respect Ghana's sovereignty rather than those who see it as a strategic outpost. The road ahead will not be easy. Washington will not forget this. Western institutions may attempt to undermine Ghana's economy, push negative narratives in the media, or use diplomatic pressure to bring Mahama back in line. But one thing is certain: Ghana has made its choice. It has chosen sovereignty over subjugation, independence over interference, a future written by Ghanaians for Ghanaians. And now, the question remains, will others follow? Africa was never meant to be divided. The artificial borders that now separate its nations were not drawn by its people, but by colonial powers that saw the continent as nothing more than land to be carved up and exploited. The result? A fractured Africa where countries compete rather than collaborate, and where foreign powers continue to pull the strings of governments that should have long been independent. But a new vision is emerging, one that seeks to undo centuries of division and reclaim Africa's rightful place on the world stage. At the heart of this movement is Ghana's leader, John Mahama. His vision is not just about Ghana, it's about Africa as a whole, a united Africa, a self-sufficient Africa, an Africa that no longer relies on the West to define its future. To achieve that, Mahama is calling for something bold: African unity. For decades, Africa's greatest minds have dreamed of self-reliance. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and Patrice Lumumba spoke of an Africa that controls its resources, dictates its policies, and stands on equal footing with the rest of the world. Yet, despite independence movements sweeping across the continent, economic and political independence remained a distant illusion. Foreign control never really ended, it just changed form. African countries gained flags and anthems, but their economies were still tied to colonial-era currencies. They gained presidents and parliaments, but their policies were still dictated by foreign institutions like the IMF and World Bank. They gained constitutions, but their true sovereignty remained in question as foreign military bases ensured Western powers retained influence. Mahama sees this for what it is, a continuation of neo-colonialism, and his vision is simple: Africa must break free. But how through unity? Pan-Africanism has been little more than an idealistic slogan, a concept discussed at summits, but rarely put into action. Mahama wants to change that. His plan focuses on three core pillars: economic independence, resource control, and political and military unity. Each of these steps is a direct challenge to the status quo. For instance, Mahama is pushing for Africa to stop using foreign-controlled currencies like the CFA franc, a relic of French colonial rule that still determines the fate of 14 African nations. Instead, he envisions a pan-African monetary system that puts African governments in charge of their economies. He is also advocating for continental energy and infrastructure projects, ensuring that Africa builds for itself, not for foreign corporations. Roads, railways, and power plants should serve African industries, not foreign extractive operations. But perhaps Mahama's boldest move is his call for a stronger African security network. At the heart of Mahama's Pan-African vision is a simple but powerful belief: Africa should own its wealth. For centuries, Africa has been the richest continent in natural resources, yet it remains one of the poorest in economic terms. The reason? Its resources have always been controlled by foreign hands. Mahama has called for African nations to end exploitative trade agreements that allow Western corporations to extract minerals, oil, and agricultural products for next to nothing, while African economies see little benefit. He is also pushing for nationalizing key industries so profits remain within Africa, building local refining plants so raw materials are turned into high-value products within the continent, and strengthening intra-African trade to ensure that African economies depend on each other rather than relying on Europe or the US. But changing the economic order comes with risks. Many African leaders who have tried to break free from Western economic dominance have faced coups, assassinations, or economic sabotage. So the question remains, can Mahama's vision survive the pushback? He is standing firm. All he needs is African unity, because if he achieves that, nothing can beat Africa. Now we know one thing: Ghana's transformation is not just about one nation, it's about the awakening of an entire continent. For decades, Africa has been trapped in a cycle of foreign influence, economic dependence, and political submission. It has been treated as a land of resources rather than a land of power. Its governments have been pressured to serve external interests rather than their people. But today, that is changing. With John Mahama at the helm, Ghana is making a statement to the world. Africa will no longer be controlled from the outside. By rejecting foreign military dominance, Ghana is setting a new standard for African sovereignty. By prioritizing economic self-sufficiency, it is proving that Africa does not need Western approval to thrive. By championing Pan-Africanism, Ghana is igniting a movement that is spreading across the continent. This is no longer just an idea. It's happening, and the world is taking notice. But history has shown that movements like this do not come without opposition. The real danger is staying in chains. Ghana's decision to take back control is not an act of rebellion. It's an act of restoration, a return to what Africa was always meant to be, a continent that governs itself, shapes its destiny, and dictates its future. And that future is no longer a distant dream. It's unfolding right now. Do you think anything can stop Africa? Let us know in the comments. Will Africa unite when it's the only thing they need the most? If you want to watch more videos like this one, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We've decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about, Africa. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.